In my personal reflection, I just shared how I experienced the transformational power of our first principle, how it changed the words that come to mind as I meet people and made me a better person. In the winter of 2013 to 2014, I went on an unexpected personal journey that was deeply introspective. It again featured our principles and sources and how they worked their way into my inner dialogue, but this time I discovered some questions that I would like to share. Just a little more background on where I was spiritually at the time. I'd been coming to First U going on 5 years. I was very active in the congregation. I was co-teaching a CYRE class, active in a connection circle. I also joined the Denominational Growth Committee, which led to serving as one of our representatives to the Delmarva cluster of UU congregations. These two groups gave me the opportunity to work side by side with so many members that I grew to admire. Vivian Gray, Barbara Kroll, Joan Priest, Paul Pinson, Reverend Richard Speck, David Shepard, Carl Toll, as well as many inspirational volunteers representing the other Delmarva Peninsula UU congregations at our cluster meetings. Through these committees, I was channeling a lot of my time and energy into cluster-level programming, including events like Beach Day and a fall retreat at Camp Taqua. These retreats were initially focused on our First U community. The last retreat, we had a proper cluster-level retreat. It was a weekend-long retreat. As the name implies, we spent a lot of time in our Denominational Growth Committee meetings talking about how to grow our congregations. We even had a forum at our last cluster retreat where we invited attendees, including several ministers from our cluster congregations, to discuss the topic. Whenever this subject comes up, the answers tend to focus on working harder, making our congregations more welcoming, more dynamic, engaging even more fully in the work of social justice. Even when prompted, I've found that groups are reluctant to consider that there might be some problem with the framing of our religion itself. Every UU that has ever tried to explain our religion to someone else knows full well that this is harder for us than it is for many denominations. But you'll not find general agreement that this is harder than it should be. We mostly accept that the challenge goes hand in hand with the joys of pluralistic religion, a religion that encourages communities of many beliefs rather than a single belief defined by a creedal statement. But after a few years of struggling with being UU from a marketing perspective, I was becoming more convinced that we needed to fix the framing of our religion itself. And I'm certainly not alone in this opinion. In 1979, when Reverend Eugene Pickett ascended to the presidency of our national governing body, the Unitarian Universalist Association, he said, "The deeper malaise lies in our confusion as to what word we have to spread. The old watchwords of liberalism, freedom, reason, and tolerance, worthy though they may be, are simply not catching the imagination of the contemporary world. They describe a process for approaching the religious depths, but they testify to no intimate acquaintance with the depths themselves. If we're ever to speak to a new age, we must supplement our seeking with some profound religious finds." 5 years after he gave this speech, we adopted the current version of our principles and sources as at the annual gathering of UU congregations that we call our General Assembly. This version represented a significant expansion and transformation of the set of 6 goals that were adopted by the Unitarian Universalist congregations in Article 2 of the 1961 bylaws of the UUA. So in 1961, we had 6 goals. It was also the first time that these ideas, now in 1985, expressed as our 7 principles, well, 6 until 95 when we added our seventh, and our six sources. And this was the first time that these ideas and some of their historical context had been more publicly proclaimed as a joint covenant of UU congregations. My inner marketer liked this trend from 1961 to 1985. In the personal reflection on our first principle that I just shared, I illustrate what transformative power could be packed into a simple, clear statement like our first principle. As a whole, our principles should get high marks for concepts, but maybe mixed reviews for power of language. And that's okay, because they're intended to be a work in progress. We're expected to review and revise Article 2 every 15 years or so. As many of you probably know, we're in one of these review periods right now. It's been going on for over 2 years, longer if you include proposals for changes to specific principles and a proposal to add an eighth principle, which were made at recent General Assemblies. Personally, I would be happier with an even more deliberative process. Why not give ourselves 7 years leading up to a revision to deeply reflect on what has worked and what hasn't in our current language? Reflect on how we and our cultural context may have changed, and take plenty of time to craft new language. In any case, my concern for the success of UU is a relevant background for the story I'm about to share. In the winter of 2013 to 2014, I was struggling with depression. I'll spare you the causal details. Suffice to say that I was having a kind of midlife crisis, exacerbated by providing care for my mother, who was suffering from dementia and frequently talked of suicide. Depression is not a common experience for me, and it can be hard to recognize for the person who's trapped therein. But mine was profound and undeniable. I was so laid low that I could barely make coffee in the morning. I could not keep track of how many scoops of grounds I had added to the basket. Many mornings I would dump browns back into the bag and start over, simply unable to count to 6. Unable to count to 6 without my mind wandering back to one obsessive, painful thought or another. A quick public service announcement. If you feel you might be struggling with depression, don't be shy about seeking help. It's very tempting to think you should be able to power through it, but why not save yourself some precious time and consider that your condition may be affecting others around you as well. And so ends my public service announcement. Now back to my story. I had a desperate need to find hope, so I turned my gaze to my newfound religion. I was not going to be satisfied with knowing that individual leaders of our congregations were full of hopeful vision. I wanted to know that we, as a denomination, were, as Reverend Pickett suggested, in possession of some profound religious finds. I was seeking both a message of hope and hope for our denomination. So every night for several months, I would wake up at 3 or 4 in the morning and ask a question about UU, often a question about the principles or the sources, searching for insight, searching for something like the good news of Unitarian Universalism. This might sound impertinent, foolish even. Why would I think this territory was not already well covered? And why would I think, if there was something to be discovered, that I might find it? The answer was that I had already heard at least 3 different UU ministers talk about the good news of UU, and each one gave a completely different answer. If there was no one right answer, why couldn't there be more to say on the topic? The first sermon I heard was by Reverend David Pyle, who argued that our first principle, the inherent worth and dignity of every person, was, in fact, the good news of UU. The next sermon was by Reverend Roberta Finkelstein, who was serving here as our developmental minister. Reverend Roberta gave the generally accepted tenet of liberal religion, that revelation is not sealed. Or, as James Luther Adams puts it in the first of his 5 smooth stones of religious liberalism depends on the principle that Revelation is continuous. Our religious tradition is a living tradition because we are always learning new truths. I think of that as a kind of meta good news. It does not give us anything specific to celebrate, but it does offer some hope for the future. So what started as me lying in bed in the middle of the night, feeling deep despair, casting about for some hopeful thought to hold on to, turned into one of the most exciting adventures of my middle age. A typical session would begin with a question. For instance, what assumptions underlie our fourth principle, a free and responsible search for truth and meaning? And then I would think, well, to hold that principle, you have to believe that we are in some sense free. It's difficult to prove that we're free, so we would have to include that as a shared belief of UUs, that humans are in some sense free. And then I would be off for a couple of hours, asking more questions and exploring the answers. As this went on, night after night, throughout the winter and into the spring, I became no less fascinated by the ideas I was exploring as the way they were created. Because I was not talking to someone or writing them down initially, I could focus on the nature of these thoughts in my consciousness. I came to think that thought is intertwined with how we represent it. In the case of thoughts connected to perceptions like images and sounds, we can conjure images and sounds in our minds. While some of this creative process must include recalling memories, it seems pretty clear to me that we can use memories to amalgamate new compositions. For much of my adult life, creating meant loading a model of a computer program into my mind, something akin to an architect imagining a building with all of its structures and choices of materials. I also played musical instruments and had a facility to play music in my mind. I could play back fairly long pieces of music in an immersive experience. I could also compose music this way. Often when asked why I don't still play music, I say something like, it was too frustrating not to be able to play the music that I heard in my head. But a more accurate explanation would be that music was an escape, a source of comfort. I would play music to drown out the negative thoughts that predominated in my consciousness. In school, I was considered to have a strong facility for language. But creative attempts at language would often trigger stronger, automatic, negative narratives in my mind. Rather than conquer this problem, during college, I found it easier to focus on other material. I settled into a career solving manufacturing challenges with software and hardware. Anytime I wanted to settle my mind, I could focus on a work problem and be fully absorbed in solving it. So part of what was intensely exciting about my early morning explorations was that I was experiencing creative language as if it was for the first time. It seemed almost miraculous. I would ask a question or reflect on an observation and then listen to the answer. I was in a kind of flow state where for many minutes at a time, I was just listening to an uninterrupted discourse on the question. It did not even feel like I was directing it. I began to understand what writers mean when they talk about their muse. I even wondered how someone reflecting during prayer could feel that the voice responding might not be their own. I'm very grateful that First U and Unitarian Universalism exists. What I've been describing was the beginning of a new and exciting way for me to explore the world. It certainly has changed my thinking. This process did not single-handedly free me from my depression, but it helped me regain a sense of hope. I did also seek professional help, and with time was able to get back to what I think of as normal. So what did I find in my search? Allow me to draw to a close with a few of these observations. Remember, I was looking for the good news of Unitarian Universalism. Setting aside the two answers already covered, our first principle and the non-specific assertion that revelation is continuous, Our sixth principle looks like a good candidate. The goal of community with peace, liberty, and justice, the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. I'll confess that the first time I read that principle, it conjured an image of a comic book hero and the Justice League. But what if we as a community really hold that vision? Even with the linguistic hedge of its achievability, the goal of world community, that's a radically hopeful principle. I actually went to Reverend Roberta at the time to see if I could get on the schedule to preach on the subject. But before I committed to a date, I asked one more question, which was, are we as a community actually invested in this principle? I decided I wasn't sure, so I went back to pondering. While thinking more about how revelation is continuous, I wondered if we were not giving ourselves full credit for some of the specific finds that we as a denomination had actually discovered. So here are a few that also changed me. Our fifth principle, the right of conscience and the democratic process within our congregations and society at large. A commitment to democracy is scary. This principle binds our fate to democracy in a way that most denominations are not bound. I love that our congregation and most UU congregations are very active in the political process. Members lobbying for just laws and spearheading get out the vote drives. I hope that our commitment to this principle might move us to the even harder work of mending the torn fabric of our society and, in some cases, considering compromise to strengthen our democracy. To paraphrase John Stuart Mill, there is no policy that is not improved when its proponents consider the truths of its opponents, and the truths of its opponents that the proponents deny. And I'm going to pause and let you unpack that for a minute, because the original language is even harder to follow, but there is a profound truth contained in there. There is no policy that is not improved when its proponents consider the truths of its opponents that the proponents deny. So in other words, when you're fighting for a policy, there is a tendency to ignore the truth of the other side as you're trying to get your policy passed. In the midst of the fight, you end up, there's basically many aspects of truth are a casualty of that battle. And if we instead could think and more deeply and listen to what the opposition is saying, we would end up making better policies. Our fifth source, humanist teachings, which counsel us to heed the guidance of reason and the results of science, and warn us against idolatries of mind and spirit. How extraordinary that we explicitly call out science as a source. While not entirely unique among religious denominations, could we be the denomination that takes on the challenge of educating ourselves and others about how to think about science? Wouldn't we all benefit from a clearer understanding of the humble nature of the pursuit of scientific knowledge? Consider that the most certain thing in science is still just a theory. All scientific facts are understood to be contextual, meaning that they're not facts at all in the sense that we think of facts, merely observations. And most importantly, science does not invalidate other ways of knowing. It is simply a way to come up with better and better descriptions of ourselves and our world, as measured by whether the description helps us predict what will happen next. Ultimately, I settled on our commitment to pluralism, the coexistence of many beliefs, as the good news of UU. This is captured in our statement of sources, which identifies the many sources of our faith tradition. I find the balance between our fourth and fifth principles particularly powerful. Jewish and Christian teachings, which call us to respond to God's love by loving our neighbors as ourselves. Humanist teachings, which counsel us to heed the guidance of reason and the results of science, and warn us against idolatries of the mind and spirit. That last line is fascinating because I had to research idolatries of the mind, and good grief, Bacon, Sir Francis Bacon. It goes back 400 years to a man who has essentially identified what has only very recently been codified by social psychology. And the idolatries of the mind are really just our intuitions, our built-in assumptions, our tendencies to see certain patterns in the world. And in some case, they work for us. In some case, they work against us. And 400 years ago, Francis Bacon was thinking about this and pointed out that our mind is not always helpful in perceiving truth. In just about every creed-based faith community, there are those that believe in the precepts of their faith and those who have some doubts. I feel for the people who live on in their community in spite of their doubts or divergent beliefs. Of course, in some cases, they may have no choice or may be choosing family and friends over spiritual authenticity. Still, this seems like a sad situation. In UU congregations, members can stay in community with each other and still be free to find what makes their life meaningful for them. Rather than feeling coerced, they will find support in following their own unique path. So several years later, I was heartened to hear Reverend Pamela Watt also call out this quality of UU as our good news. She described it as being in our DNA to navigate different faith traditions and individual beliefs. One test of whether this really is an essential idea is to ask, well, if UU were to disappear from the face of the earth, would we be okay as long as some group of congregations were to continue this work? And the answer for me is yes. And this brings me finally to our own Reverend Dr. Larry Pierce, who has the idea that were it to be introduced in the next version of the covenant of our UU congregations, brings me to our own Reverend Dr. Larry Pierce, who has an idea that were it to be introduced in the next version of the covenant of UU congregations, could be a singular catalyst for growth in the coming decades. If you were to attend a newcomer orientation with Reverend Larry, you would hear him explain that rather than principles, we should think of the 7 as practices. Now, Reverend Larry has so many brilliant ideas that I'm not sure this one has had a chance to bubble to the top priority for him. But think about it. The fact that a creedless religion has principles is confusing. The second meaning of creed in Merriam-Webster's online dictionary is principle. The reason that our principles, individually or as a group, don't amount to a creed is that they only imply beliefs about human nature. What do you think of this concept of taking the insights into human nature that we currently express as principles and rephrasing them as practices? Could this add clarity to how we explain ourselves to others? I do hope that what comes next for our practices and sources upholds our strengths and builds on them with profound statements that reverberate in our inner voices until we fill the world with words that inspire and sustain us. Words worth repeating. Thank you.